vertical vid. I'm reading From Liberalism, Ancient and Modern, an essay by Leo Strauss, Perspectives on the Good Society, all about Jews and Christians in America, writing in 1963. This quote, this passage stood out. To say the least, it is always easier for Christians to recognize the divine origin of Judaism than for Jews to recognize the divine origin of Christianity. On the other hand, it was easier for Jews to recognize that Christians may have a share in the world to come than it was for Christians to recognize that Jews may be saved. This is due to the Jewish union of the carnal and the spiritual, of the secular and the eternal, of the tribal and the universal. The Torah, which contains the promise of the eternal redemption of all children of Adam, citing Maimonides, was given to or accepted by Israel alone. As a consequence, it was easier for Jews to admit the divine mission of Christianity than it was for Christians to admit the abiding divine mission of Judaism. It is therefore not surprising, blah, 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 that this Mr., he's at some kind of luncheon, Mr. Raylardsdam pointed out, the first genuine meeting of Jews and Christians should have been initiated by a Jew, Franz Rosenzweig, and that a comparable Christian response to this Jewish call should not yet have been forthcoming. I'm finding with reading Strauss that there's a density. There's a density to the writing, to the reference. Unlike with Christopher Lasch, who I was just reading and whose thesis is more or less clear, only requiring a kind of elaboration. Strauss writes pretty dryly. It's not as exciting to read. It demands more concentration, which is probably why I haven't really read that much Strauss to date. Although he was kind of popular in my college. I knew a lot of people who were big Strauss heads, my wife amongst them. Some of my college acquaintances went to a summer program, like a think tank funded Strauss after school program called the Hertog Institute. And talked all about this stuff, and friends of mine who were Christians and friends of mine who were Jews went to this thing. And it seems like to write and to think and to intellectualize at the level of encompassing both Jew and Christian requires a sort of distant, steady hand. Strauss is sort of trying to address things with the broadest frame possible. Rather than try to go point for point through this essay. It's a pretty short essay, but it's jam-packed. I'll just kind of give my general reflections on it. The theme, it jumps around a little bit. He talks about contemporary fiction and whether it should be considered post-Christian or something else. You know, the notion that we live in some kind of post-Christian era, and so even the atheism isn't pure atheism. Atheism is itself a kind of anti-Christianity. It's defined by negation. So he was kind of interrogating that idea. And talking about how political solidarity is in some ways aided and in some ways hindered by religious diversity. And that religious diversity is the true, what is talked about as, diversity is our strength. That kind of diversity is a kind of false diversity, insofar as it neglects diversity between religious viewpoints, insofar as it only treats of superficial diversities that can be wallpapered over with common clothing and customs and so on. That theological diversity is kind of the bedrock, is the only quote-unquote diversity that really has teeth. I switch hands. My arm's getting tired. But yes, basically, that they're, like in life generally, I can't help reflecting. There is a difficulty in switching perspectives between men and women, between Christian and Jew. That, as much as you might describe things beautifully in prose and poetry, every book, every time you read a book, it's the contents of a book is always refracted through the sifter of your own experience, your own touchstones, the lily pads you hop upon. And for Christian and Jew, regardless of the intellectual content of what is said and what is replied, what is counter-said and counter-replied, there are potent, emotionally charged reference points, like the Holocaust or the history of Jews in medieval Europe, a whole perspective, a whole way of being in the world. It's like we're playing different video games, watching different movies. The protagonists are different. The set of characters, it's shifted. It's like an optical illusion, which can look like a wheelbarrow or a bowl of bananas, a ripe mango or an old rotting apple, depending on the way you twist it. Not literally twist it even, but just the way your eye twists it, the muscle of the mind. And in Christianity we have figures like St. Paul, who was a practicing Pharisee, one of the murderers of St. Stephen. And it seems like those great conversions are important, are emphasized by God, because it shows sort of the beauty or the plan of God, the way God does jujitsu through history and in us, on us, in our personal lives, on our relations to things, the way we're frustrated. We're continually frustrated and challenged by life. And it's an effort to untie the knots, to get us into the right formation, out of the wrong contortion, be able to see the other, to walk and to see, to understand truly, not just at the level of scientific data. Elsewhere in this essay, Strauss talks about science and bureaucrats, basically, is my impression, sort of how they feed off of each other. Science as a basis for, like, secular cynicism. All these attitudes, just trying to bring these things into greater focus, greater awareness. If I get more clarity on any of this, I'll post another video. For now, my son is waking up. I gotta go.